There's a lot of evidence for the lab leak hypothesis for the origin of COVID-19. Various knowledgeable figures have spoken up about it. The WHO and the US president have refused to rule it out. But all of the evidence we've seen so far is circumstantial. Have a series of new reports now conclusively ruled it out as a possibility in favour of crossover from live animals at the Huanan Seafood Market. That's what the authors claim, and it's a message that has been widely reported accordingly, so let's have a look. Regular viewers will know that I have been covering the evolving evidence, the arguments and the thinking around the origins of COVID-19 quite a bit on this channel. When I did my first video on it, I started off with a presumption of a 50% likelihood of a lab leak as a starting position, in the absence of any data at all, and then gradually, bit by bit, new evidence is sometimes nudged one way, sometimes nudged the other. I was left by the end, having nudged over to believing lab leak to be around an 80% probability, which is probably as high as you should ever go in the absence of direct evidence as opposed to circumstantial evidence. Then a few months later, having not looked at it again, it's very easy in your own mind to just casually let that gap drift smaller and smaller and to emotionally come to a firm conclusion. I might have done that, I'm not sure. In any case, several papers were recently published that claim to push the balance of probabilities radically in the opposite direction. As you know, on this channel there's nothing we like better than to have a challenge to an idea that we've come to believe was likely to be true. All we ask is that the challenge is well argued and has a body of credible evidence behind it. So in this video, we will look at the new evidence with an open mind to see where we end up. Before we do that, let's just very quickly recap some of the factors that had seemed significant from the earlier research. We started by noting some obvious features. Here was a novel virus that had originated in bats, and of all the places it could have emerged, it emerged in a city that has one of the few laboratories that studies coronaviruses in bats. Not only that, one of the only ones in the world that public grant details showed to have been working on gain-of-function research on exactly those sorts of viruses to make them more adapted to humans in exactly the way that COVID-19 turns out to be. So you start with a pretty big coincidence. It's influential, it's a long way from conclusive, because in a world of billions of people doing many things, large numbers of hugely unlikely coincidences happen every single day. Plus, as some were quick to point out, it's not as surprising as it seems. Laboratories tend to study what is an issue locally. So it's not a surprise that a laboratory studies bat coronaviruses in the country where there are lots of those to be found. A lot of the other factors then focused on what seemed to be the actions of various people to cover up. You had a group of scientists around Anthony Fauci and the NIH who Freedom of Information requests had suspected the virus had come from a lab, but then within days of that were producing a paper arguing the exact opposite. The Proximal Origins paper, which had provided some early sequencing information, stated that it showed strong evidence that SARS-CoV-2 is not the product of purposeful manipulation, although it didn't rule out the possibility that a natural virus had been transported to the lab and might then have escaped. Basic research involving passage of bat SARS-CoV-like viruses in cell culture and/or animal models has been ongoing for many years in biosafety level 2 laboratories across the world, and there are documented instances of laboratory escapes of SARS-CoV. We must therefore examine the possibility of an inadvertent laboratory release of SARS-CoV-2. That part of the paper did not get so much attention, and at the time since Trump was president, and since he had personally floated the idea of a lab leak, it seemed that most of the liberal establishment and the virologists wanted to shut down what was deemed to be a crazy conspiracy theory. It was only after Trump had left office that people started to look anew at the question, in case you thought that science and politics never gets mixed up. Then you had Peter Daszak, the man who was directly involved in the Wuhan Institute's bat coronavirus work, leading the organisation of scientists initially behind the scenes to rubbish any suggestion of a lab leak, calling it a conspiracy theory, and initially doing so with no acknowledgement of his massive conflict of interest, a fact that was only acknowledged by The Lancet long time after the publication of the original joint letter we now know was authored by Daszak. On the China end, you had the online database of viruses having been taken offline just before the pandemic became public. Seemed suspicious. You had China's refusal to cooperate. You had the oddities in how the early paper on COVID-19 published by Shi Zhengli, the head of the Wuhan Institute, did not mention that a close relative to COVID-19 had been sequenced a couple of years earlier, nor that it had been discovered in a cave where a number of workers had gotten sick with flu-like symptoms. That fact was discovered and highlighted by a group of independent researchers, leading Xi to publish an addendum to her paper setting the record straight, without commenting about how the update flat out contradicted some of what was written in the original. None of which was proof of anything. But it was rather clear that virologists involved in research were deeply worried they collectively might get the blame for COVID-19, something that could have happened regardless of whether or not it was true or fair. Some of them have been extremely active campaigners against the idea, disparaging those who investigated it, so some people naturally jumped to the worst conclusions about those scientists and their motivations, but that didn't entirely fit the facts either, so really we just didn't know. And why was China apparently covering up? Well, it could have been because it knew COVID started in the lab and didn't want to be blamed for a world pandemic, but then China was no fan either of the idea that it started via an animal spillover event in a wet market in their country, so it could perfectly easily be that China doesn't know how it started, but could see how all too easily its enemies in the West might use this as an opportunity to turn the world against it. As you would expect, there are many more specific details in all of that, but that is the broad brush backstory. I'll provide links to all the previous videos if you want to go back over any of that detail. So now we've seen 2 new papers specifically suggesting that they move the needle on this whole discussion. Well, how do we evaluate all of this, being non-experts in the field? This is my approach. First, read the papers, see what the authors say about what they show and their significance. Second, if it's relevant, check any important references the papers make, ensure that they provide the evidence that they claim they do. I've come across papers in the past that cited references, but when you checked them, did not actually support the claims that were being made. Third, then look to the criticisms of the papers from those who disagree with them. See if the arguments are at a level we can evaluate or if they're too technical. One can be constructively skeptical, but if you're not an expert in the field, don't go running off thinking you can jump to obvious and intuitive conclusions that that piece of research whose conclusions you dislike must be rubbish. That says nothing about the research and everything about your lack of interest in anything that doesn't confirm your priors. We can do better. So that's a process. Let's start then by looking at the principal papers which were published in the journal Science. The case that they make is that although we don't have all of the data that we would wish for, thanks to the paucity of cooperation from China, that which we do have from the earlier stages of the outbreak provide the basis for useful study anyway. Starting with this paper, the molecular epidemiology of multiple zoonotic origins of SARS-CoV-2. This paper says that looking at the virus samples that were available from the initial outbreak in Wuhan, they identified 2 distinct lineages, 2 lines with very slight genetic difference. They tried to establish whether these could have arisen after just one of them made the jump to humans, but they showed that this was highly unlikely. They said that it indicated firstly that there were 2 separate animal spillover events, not just for one. And it would also suggest that it was unlikely that SARS-CoV-2 circulated widely in humans before November 2019. Now you might ask, how likely is it that this rare animal spillover happened not once, but twice? The answer surely is that it is perfectly likely, assuming the animal spillover scenario is correct. The thing that usually stops this from happening is that most viruses carried by animals are not well adapted to humans. So if they make the crossover, then the virus goes no further, nobody even notices. If you have animals that are carrying a disease that has strong abilities to infect humans, and you're processing them through a wet market, it would kind of be surprising if they didn't jump at that point relatively often. What it might suggest, however, is that the lab leak theory becomes less likely. In the original scenario, the question was whether someone at the Wuhan lab had become infected and had either visited the market themselves or had unknowingly infected another person who subsequently did so. The market then became a key location for spreading the virus, but not the actual origin of the virus. Now that's entirely feasible, so long as you presume the Wuhan laboratory is not being candid in their statements about what was or wasn't at the laboratory and whether anyone was found to have antibodies afterwards. It doesn't require a big complicated conspiracy theory to have that suspicion, by the way, with China visibly pushing away any potential suggestion of blame. But if there were two distinct lineages at the point where the virus jumped into humans, that makes the scenario much less believable. Because, so the argument goes, you would have to have two separate lab workers infected on two different occasions, separated by weeks, both of whom went to the wet market and not really any place much else. And that does become a rather fantastical proposition, if the evidence provided by the paper is correct. The second paper is this one. The Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market in Wuhan was the early epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic by Worobey et al. Now, before we go on to discuss the paper itself, I need to just say a couple of words about the authors of these papers, because it's worth noting, and I am certainly not the first to do so, that some of the names attached to these papers include some from that early group of scientists around Dr. Fauci who drafted the Proximal Origins paper and who have acted as rather active campaigners against the idea of a lab leak. Names such as Christian Anderson, Andrew Rambout, Edward C. Holmes, Robert F. Gary. And in addition to those, there's Angela Rasmussen, who has likewise been a very consistent and vocal campaigner. I rather wish those names were not attached to it, but it doesn't matter, and I'll tell you why. And it's the same principle I apply to every single issue and controversy that we look at on this channel. The research stands or falls on its own merits. It tells you what data it uses, it tells you how it came to its conclusions. Advocates for one side or the other can lose their objectivity, and that is the case for people on both sides. Some are good enough scientists that won't affect their work, others may be less so, but then the latter will produce work that doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny. On this channel, we never argue against an argument or proposition on the basis of who's making it. And especially when some people are held to be tainted by people on one side, and those people may simply be wrong about whether or not those people should be tainted. In scientific research, people are still meant to declare any conflicts of interest. It's not as though we don't recognise that we should be aware of such things. It's not as though conflicts of interest can't influence the results. We do know that they can. But it's all too easy, as people often do in the comment sections here, to simply discount something you don't like on the basis of who said it. It's worth noting as well that although those authors have form in seeking to shut down discussion of a lab leak, the principal author, Michael Worobey, was actually a signatory to a letter in Nature calling for it to be properly investigated. So, these things are never so simple. With all that out of the way, what does the paper actually say? Let's take it direct from the abstract. The Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market in Wuhan, China, was identified as a likely source of cases in early reports, but later this conclusion became controversial. We show the earliest known COVID-19 cases from December 2019, including those without reported direct links, were geographically centred on this market. We report that live SARS-CoV-2 susceptible mammals were sold at the market in late 2019, and within the market, SARS-CoV-2 positive environmental samples were spatially associated with vendors selling live mammals. While there is insufficient evidence to define upstream events and exact circumstances remain obscure, our analyses indicate the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 occurred in the live wildlife trade in China and show that the Huanan market was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Survey looks at the earliest cases, drawing from data from various sources and including both cases that were directly linked to the market, workers, people who shopped there, along with cases that had no link to the market. And they found that the earliest cases, linked and unlinked, nevertheless clustered around the market. Shown on this map, using data from the World Health Organization of reported cases. The cluster is focused on the market, not on the main population centre of Wuhan. Over January and February, the later cases became more diffuse and spread out as the virus spread across Wuhan, as shown by this map, with cases identified by data from Weibo's COVID-19 assistance app. That's what you would expect to see if the outbreak had started at the market. And this pattern applies to both cases of lineage A and lineage B. They also showed that if a small number of individuals were carrying the virus and it was simply about finding a super spreader location from where it was going to propagate at speed, the market was not where you would really expect that to happen. Using social media data, they identified the locations within Wuhan that had the most visitors in crowded indoor settings, markets, supermarkets and malls. The Huanan market was a long way down the chain, suggesting that the odds against it becoming the main superspreader event by accident was significantly reduced. They then used data from the Chinese CDC for 585 environmental samples taken from various surfaces in the market on the 1st and the 12th of January 2020. They integrated these with public online maps and photographic evidence, data from business registries and the like, to place the positive samples in the market in relation to where evidence suggested that live animals were being sold, including where they were likely being sold and they shouldn't have been, using fines to free business owners for illegal sale of live animals. When they looked at the distribution of positive samples, they were overwhelmingly associated, they report, with the west side of the market where live animals were sold. The report authors note the limitations of the data. As we know, China stopped cooperating with data sharing at a relatively early stage. Although they'd been able to recover location data for most of the early cases, they did not have access to coordinates for all of the cases. Obviously, although there is some circumstantial evidence of clustering of samples around the area where live animals were sold, there is still no intermediate host that's been identified to show how the virus went from bats to something else to humans. Notwithstanding those limitations, the work certainly gives some pretty compelling evidence. I feel like it makes a major shift in the balance of probability that I'd reached anyway. But what does the other side say? Because there are researchers and campaigners who have been officially fighting for the lab leak to remain a valid and respectable hypothesis. They have certainly morphed over time into advocacy on the other side, so the same caveats apply to them as apply to the authors of these papers. The chief source of constructive criticism of the papers comes from Alina Chan, who was involved with the earliest stages of the movement to uncover the truth about COVID-19 origins and who co-authored a book talking about that process, Viral, with Matt Ridley. She did a piece responding to the papers and she makes two specific comments. One is to note what I've already noted here, that some of the authors were previously holding the position of definitively ruling out a lab leak origin. That's not an argument about the study itself, so we ignore that. The second comment is the central argument against, which is that the data the paper relies on was subject to what is called ascertainment bias. Chan explained this as well as anyone in a related tweet where she said this. December 2019 to mid-January 2020, Chinese CDC, Hubei CDC, Wuhan CDC specifically looked for potential COVID-19 cases with links to Huanan Market or living in the vicinity of a market. February 2022, Western scientists say, wow, so many of the early cases were centred around the market. To support the proposition, she quoted the WHO China report, which provided one of the key data sources. 30th of December, a citywide case screening was conducted targeting people with pneumonia of unknown origin, abnormal blood routine test, and exposure history with Huanan Market. 31st December, continued epidemiology surveillance at several hospitals close to Huanan Market, and the neighbourhood of Huanan Market. She also referred to the January 2020 observation by the investigation team that in late December 2019, Wuhan CDC did a retrospective search for pneumonia patients potentially linked to the market, found additional patients linked to the market. She adds, we can say that the first 4 market cases were identified without a bias, but every case identified after that, with or without a link to the market, was likely affected by ascertainment bias amongst the Wuhan CDC investigators. Remember, they didn't have rapid diagnostics then. The principal author of the paper, Michael Worobey, did produce a separate paper analysing the early cases and purporting to show that they were free from ascertainment bias. It's an interesting paper, not wholly conclusive. So, for instance, it says that on the 30th of December, the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission issued emergency notices to local hospitals, alerting them to patients with unexplained pneumonia. Contrary to Alina Chan's quotes from the WHO, he says, notably, individuals were enrolled according to clinical presentation, not epidemiological information such as connections to Huanan Market. For that statement, he references this paper, looking at the early cases in 2020. It's not entirely clear that this paper, which was written to describe symptoms, not to attest to the nature of the early alerts, provides the backing that he suggests. It can be read that way. Having noted that the shared history of the seafood market was a factor in the early alert, it then notes that 59 suspected cases were transferred to a designated hospital. Since the cause was unknown at the onset of these emerging infections, the diagnosis of pneumonia of unknown cause in Wuhan was based on clinical characteristics, chest imaging, and the ruling out of common bacterial and viral pathogens that cause pneumonia. But in a paper for which the process of locating cases was not a primary point of the research it was doing, it's hard to know how much weight to put on those specific words. Worobey tried in his paper to avoid doubt by going back to the very first reported cases that were registered before it was even known that there was a new viral outbreak that was underway. He goes into the detail of the different cases and finds 19 that came to light before any alerts went out. He then notes that 10 out of the 19 had links to the Huanan Market. It's also the case that the text Chan quotes don't all necessarily go one way. So, for example, she quoted the WHO report, page 42, saying this: an association with the Huanan Market was identified among some of the earliest recognised cases, and for a short period, until mid-January 2020, exposure to the Huanan Market was included in the case definition. It then follows, however, by noting it rapidly became clear, however, that there were cases without a link to Huanan Market, and this element of the definition was dropped a few days after being introduced. But that just leaves a fog of ambiguity hanging around. The Worobey study looks at the early cases. Was the definition changed before or after the cut-off for those cases? Well, Chan believes the answer to that is clear. The China WHO joint study and Worobey et al. 2022 evaluate the 174 early cases with symptom onset in December 2019. The case definition requirement for a link to the market had only been removed on January the 18th, 2020. This means that most, if not all, of the early cases considered by Worobey et al. Had been identified with ascertainment bias. So look, where does this leave us? Struggling to make sense of poor data is the obvious answer. Has the recent exchange been sufficient to nudge my perception of the issue one way or the other? Well, yes. Some of the information that doesn't hinge on the cases also seems to point to the live animal area of the market, and if the data was not subject to bias, the case made is pretty compelling. Bear in mind the data could have been subjected to bias, but still that only emphasised the correct story that was there in any case. It has to be the bias overturns what would have been a different pattern if seen with accurate data, which is asking a lot, especially given the other two factors, such as the two different strains and the unlikelihood that there were two leaks from the lab. For me, I am nudged right back to 50-50 on this. All the evidence is still circumstantial. All the voices arguing seem to be strong advocates and campaigners for their different positions. It's hard to find demonstrably knowledgeable, neutral observers. Nevertheless, there's too much substance here to simply dismiss it with a wave of the hand, and it looks like it will remain a mystery for some time to come. This was summed up by Jesse Bloom, virologist at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Centre. He said this: "I don't disagree with the analysis, but I don't agree that any of the data are strong enough or complete enough to say anything very confidently other than that the Huanan Seafood Market was clearly a super-spreading event." Sometimes no answer is the only answer we have. Unsatisfying, but there it is. Well, what's your take? If you had to put a percentage on whether you think this is down to a lab leak or a natural spillover event, what would your percentage be? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.